Welcome to the Together.eu Ireland podcast. We are a community of people who believe in democracy and who want to give it real meaning as the next European elections approach. Together.eu is a project run by the European Parliament, dedicated to getting as many people as possible involved in the democratic life of Europe. It is a community of individual citizens across the EU. This week, we will be talking with Dr. Rory Costello from the University of Limerick. Welcome, Rory, to the Together.eu podcast. We're delighted to have you on. How are you today?
Thanks, Deirdre. Great to be here. Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. So, Rory, you're a lecturer at the University of Limerick. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what you lecture in, what your interests are?
So I lecture in European politics, generally speaking. So not only the European Union, but also comparative European politics. So where we look at the politics of European countries. So they'd be my main areas of teaching. But I also do some research on Irish politics as well as European.
Amazing. So you're fairly well knowledgeable in this area to, I guess, tell our listeners about the EU in general. What's kind of coming up for the European Parliament? What will be the hot topics, the debates for their next mandate?
Yeah, I mean, I think these elections coming up are crucial, really. I mean, in the past, you would have been forgiven for thinking that European Parliament elections didn't matter all that much, at least compared to national elections. I don't think that is true now. I mean, this is a very important election and potentially consequential one for a number of reasons. One is the types of issues that are at stake. So, historically, the European Union was mostly an economic entity, and most of the things that it decided on were to do with the single market, which isn't the top priority for most voters. But now there are a number of different issues on the agenda that I think are quite important for voters. So, for example, foreign policy is a very hot topic, and the European Union plays an increasingly big role in terms of foreign policy in a number of ways. So obviously you've got the war in Ukraine, which didn't exist the last time we had European Parliament elections in 2019. So this is going to be a big issue. In the elections, the European Union has been providing an awful lot of funding to Ukraine, financial aid, but also military aid. And that's the first time that the European Union has ever done that, provided military aid to a third country. And so that's a question for the future. So to what extent does the European Union need to provide more military aid to Ukraine? Is there a risk that if Russia were to be victorious in that conflict, that the EU security would be under threat? So that's one debate that will be had and that needs to be had. There's the question of enlargement. So Ukraine is now a candidate country for EU membership, and that is something that will have to be. So it's currently being negotiated, but once those accession negotiations are finished, that will have to be voted on by the European Parliament. So that's another potentially important issue, and it's a large country, and it would potentially be quite consequential if the Ukraine was to join the European Union. So it's a debate again that has to be had. Then, of course, you've got the Israel-Hamas war going on as well, which has, unlike the Ukraine situation, that has really divided member states. So in relation to Ukraine, European countries, EU member states have been quite united by and large, and have been able to agree on a number of important initiatives. But that hasn't been true in relation to Gaza. There have been deep divisions within the European Union. So again, this is something that will be debated ahead of these elections. So yeah, foreign policy, and I mean more broadly on the question of foreign policy and defence, I think really there's a big debate that is being had in Europe at the moment, and that will feature in these elections over how the European Union defends itself in the future. Can it rely on the United States to provide that defence, as it has traditionally and historically done through NATO? Donald Trump says that if he becomes president, then all bets are off, and that he's not going to honor the United States' commitment to NATO to defend Europe. So there's a lot of there are a lot of people who are pushing for the European Union to beef up its own autonomous defence capabilities. But again, a lot of people would be wary of that. And here in Ireland, there would be a lot of opposition to any moves towards a kind of common European defence. So these are very important issues. That's only in the area of foreign policy and defence, but there are a range of other areas too where these elections, I think, are going to be quite important. I mean, the environment and immigration, just to name a couple. And again, these are both areas where the European Union does play a very important role.
Yeah, that's for sure. I suppose, and I guess for our younger viewers as well, like they've grown up hearing so much about the environment and trying to protect it. I'm sure that will be on their minds as they're kind of choosing who they'd like to put forward. But definitely, I suppose what you're saying, like the European elections are incredibly important that we can vote in, and obviously we can't vote in the US elections. We don't know what's going to happen over that side of the water. And I'm just remembering a quote, and I can't remember the full extent of it, but that, you know, Europe was an economic giant, and then the last part was a military worm. I don't know if you know it. Probably,
Yeah,
but...
yeah, that was a quote from, I think it was a Belgian foreign minister back in the 1990s, that EU is an economic giant and a political dwarf and a military worm. Yeah, that's right. And, you know, to a large extent, you know, I think that does hold true today. I mean, the European Union, collectively, all of the EU member states, when you put together their defense budgets, is quite substantial. I think it's the second highest globally in terms of spending on defense when you add all of those 27 member states' defense budgets together. But that's not the same thing as having one large, you know, defense capability. And the European Union doesn't have its own army or its own defense capability. So you have all of these separate armies, which, you know, haven't trained together to any great extent, and they're using different equipment. So it's not, you know, the European Union is not a military power by any stretch of the imagination. And its foreign policy capacity has been fairly weak by the requirement that any foreign policy decision has to have the agreement of all 27 member states. You know, so if you look at most areas where the European Union decides, a qualified majority, so, you know, a majority with somewhat over a majority of member states would be enough to have a decision. But on foreign policy, it's one of the few areas where you have to have a unanimous agreement among member states. So any one member state can veto any foreign policy decision. It makes it very difficult for the EU to take action on foreign policy. And we see that in Gaza. So the European Union didn't say anything substantial on Gaza until a few weeks ago was their first kind of agreed position, calling somewhat wishy-washy position, calling for humanitarian pauses in Gaza. Before that, they weren't even able to agree on any agreed text or statement.
Definitely, and with, like you were saying, the prospect of EU enlargement, that would only become more difficult as time goes on.
Yeah, that's true, and it's not just Ukraine that is a candidate country. There are many other countries that have candidate status. Now, having a candidate status doesn't guarantee that the country will join, but there are a number of countries in the Western Balkans, Moldova. So, you know, there are several countries who in the future could join the European Union. And I think there are talks ongoing about the need to change the way decisions are made, particularly on foreign policy, so that decisions could be made by a majority vote. So there's a group of member states led by Germany that are pushing for that. But a lot of other countries don't want that. Ireland is one of those that's not too hot on the idea of moving to majority voting on foreign policy. So it's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. And that, I guess, makes the decision-making process even more lengthy if it doesn't, because if it's, you know, trying to get a unanimous decision means constant talking. And I guess we saw that with the immigration policy and that's been going on for the past 10 years, trying to get member states to agree on something. So
yeah, immigration policy has been a sticking point for a long time. So, you know, going back to the what was referred to as the migrant crisis in 2015, 2016, a solution to the fact that some countries tend to bear the brunt of the challenge of dealing with asylum applications, particularly countries on the southern borders of the European Union, Italy and Greece. So they have significant challenges in coping, whereas other countries have been relatively isolated from the issue. Now it's back on the agenda again with a bang, because the numbers seeking asylum in Europe have really gone up again over the last year or so. And so there has finally been an agreement, a new pact on immigration and asylum, which the current Irish government has decided to opt into. So Ireland has the possibility to opt in or out when it comes to migration policy, but the current Irish government has signalled its intention to opt in to this new deal on migration, which is somewhat controversial because it will make it more difficult for people seeking asylum to gain entry, because they can be the process for screening will be enhanced, and the time that the decision will take for a decision on their application will be shortened, so they can be rejected much more quickly. Asylum seekers will be able to be detained at the borders of the European Union. So it's kind of a turn to the right on immigration. But as well as that, there's also an effort to try to iron out some of these imbalances between countries in terms of their share of responsibility for asylum. So countries will, as part of this new deal, they can either agree to share responsibilities for asylum seekers. If one country is taking too many, then other countries would have to take some of those applicants, or else they can make a financial contribution instead. So that's the way that this new deal works in terms of bringing about solidarity, a degree of solidarity between member states in addressing this issue.
I mean, it's a touchy topic, as are a lot of the topics, I guess, that the EU has to deal with in some ways. And I guess we're seeing, or at least feeling a little bit more Euroscepticism. There's a lot more parties kind of coming out to the forefront that people are kind of voting for on a national level, that I guess may come into Europe that little bit more, possibly with the elections coming up. And I mean, I know it has been like in recent years with Poland and Hungary talking about the rule of law in those member states in terms of democracy. But I guess, just to highlight how important, democracy is, that it's still, and in some member states, it's still quite young, and that voting is our way of protecting democracy. And I guess it's important to understand what Europe does in order to vote for the candidates that you think would best represent Ireland in Europe, to have that voice.
Yeah, and it's not just the candidates to best represent Ireland. That's an important aspect of it, but it's also, what candidates or what parties, whose policies do you agree with on these European level issues? So they're there partly to represent Ireland and defend Ireland's interests. But that role is it's not just a case of our MEPs representing our country. That's an important aspect of it. But it's also you need to vote for somebody who you agree with on those issues that are at stake in this election. And I mean, you mentioned there the surge to the right in many countries, and the growth of kind of far right parties, and far right parties are expected to make significant gains in this election, and that's potentially quite consequential, because if you were to look back at the European Parliament over the years, there's always been a majority in the European Parliament from the main centre parties. You've got the big centre left Socialist and Democrat group, and then you've got the big centre right European People's Party, and then you've got a Liberal Party as well. And between those three centrist groupings, they've always had a very overwhelming majority. And then there've been smaller parties to the left and the right of those. but it is possible that they might lose that majority if there is a big surge to the right in these elections, which would make it very difficult for the European Parliament to get things done if it's that divided. So there's a number of kind of issues in which it might be difficult for the European Parliament to move ahead, like the environment being one of them, if that majority of the centre slips away in these elections.
Yeah, definitely. We're kind of used to the way the Parliament is now, I suppose, and their views, of course, with the left, like the Green Party, I guess, getting a little bit more airtime, if you wish, in recent years. But I guess that is our democracy at the same time, that you have the right to choose who you agree with, who you think best stands up for what you believe in. And that's something that I guess, the European Parliament or the European Union kind of being that peace project at the start is something that I think, not that necessarily we've forgotten about why we came together. We all remember the World Wars, or we all learned about the World Wars, but I think sometimes why we're here sort of gets lost a little bit in the face of, I guess, crises, the environment or immigration or war itself.
Yeah, I mean, you can be cynical about the European Union and its claims to be a peace project, but I mean, you only have to look at the way relations between EU member states and the United Kingdom deteriorated after Brexit to show how conflict can happen between countries. When countries are competing with one another rather than working together, conflict is never far away. And of course, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, there was a lot of saber rattling going on both sides, and the British were unhappy about issues to do with Gibraltar in the southern Spain, and there were the defense minister in Britain at the time made reference to the Falklands War, and so there was a lot of fighting talk going on, which never would have happened were the United Kingdom still a member of the European Union. So I think that it does, economic integration between countries does remove competition between them, and it removes the premise or the basis for conflict. So I think it certainly has contributed to peace on the continent.
I guess Brexit, I mean, it was such a big thing, 2 years ago. And now it's almost completely out of people's minds. But do you think that could come to the forefront coming up to the elections in Ireland? We'll say between like the relationship between us and the UK and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a major issue, actually. It does seem to have slipped off the agenda. There was an agreement made to try to improve trade through the new border checks for goods coming into Northern Ireland. And since then we haven't heard a lot about it. I mean, even Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, in a speech recently, she said, "Oh, I've forgotten about Brexit." So it's something that is, we had catastrophized it a little bit in the immediate aftermath of the vote. That this was going to be a disaster, but a no deal Brexit would have been a disaster for Ireland. But we did get a deal, and so there is a free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. So there's a lot of extra red tape to deal with trade between the UK and the EU. But apart from that, things are carrying on. Now, it has had negative consequences for the UK, I will say. But for us, we seem to have escaped relatively unscathed.
I guess other than the cost of living crisis that's I suppose all around us at the moment. And I guess that's something that the EU can help with in some aspects. It's kind of, I guess, a national competence and an EU competence in in some ways when we talk about the economics that I guess the EU is the giant in. So I'm sure that'll be on people's minds coming up to the elections as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis are, to the forefront of voters' minds. But they aren't really the issues that I guess people should be voting on in the European Parliament election, because MEPs won't be deciding on. MEPs won't be responsible for policy in that area. So housing is a national, as you mentioned, it's something that's the responsibility of the national government. So it's not really something that MEPs are going to have a huge impact on. And the cost of living, I mean, there is a certain European dimension to that, but in other ways, it's kind of the result of global developments that are, even beyond the European Union, such as, we had a spike in inflation as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the war in Ukraine and various different things. So I don't think that these are necessarily the issues that should determine who you vote for in the European Parliament election. I would be suggesting that parties' positions on issues like the environment, which the European Union has a huge role to play on, international relations, as we've already discussed, immigration, if that's an issue that you care about, is something that the European Union has a very big role on. So these are the types of things I think that are more relevant, because I mean, it still remains the case that for many of the things that voters care an awful lot about, to do with the economy, to do with taxes and spending, so public services, to do with crime and policing and law and order, those are the responsibility of national governments.
Yeah.
And so it's national elections that you should be using to have your say on those issues.
I guess just to wrap up our episode, I'd like to ask you, why should you vote? Why should people vote in elections, just as a quick conclusion?
Well, let me answer that by giving you a brief example. So a number of weeks ago, there was a vote in the European Parliament on something called the Nature Restoration Bill, which was designed to protect biodiversity in Europe by setting aside a proportion of land in every country for rewetting, rewilding, etc. Now that passed by a hair's breadth in the European Parliament. If the composition of the European Parliament changed, as it will change in the wake of this election in one direction or another, that vote might have been very different. Now, as it happens, the Nature Restoration Bill is currently held up in the other decision-making body, the Council, where the national governments meet. But decisions in the European Parliament have huge consequences. They might not be on the issues that are always to the forefront in voters' minds, but they are certainly on very important issues that have consequences, real consequences for people's lives. So you need to vote for a party or candidates who align with your views on these issues, and it can have huge consequences for all of us.
That's a very good example. Thank you so much, Rory, for joining us on our podcast this evening.
Well, delighted to be here. Thanks, Deirdre. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. And just to say to our viewers to #use your vote in the upcoming European elections.